I think I have an out of date. Mr. Gardner and Ms. Wilkie. I hope you can hear us clearly there, Minister.
I can, thanks, Chair.
Okay, cool. Minister, you don't need to be sworn as you are under your continuing oath as a Member of Parliament, as a Minister. Ms. Wilkie, I think we've already had you sworn for the purpose of this inquiry. So, Mr. Gardner, yes, and welcome back. And Mr. Gardner, we'll just ask you to take either an oath or an affirmation, and after giving us your name and position.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll take the affirmation. I'm Philip Gardner. I'm Deputy Secretary of Commercial Commissioning and Procurement in New South Wales Treasury. And I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thanks, Mr. Gardner. Minister, there's an opportunity for you to now make a brief opening statement, should you so choose.
Thanks, Chair. I'll use this as an opportunity to thank the people who have been involved in this whole response to COVID-19, both Treasury officials, revenue officials, Office of Small Business, all those officials who support the government and support the community in relation to the response to a very significant health issue, which the government has had to respond to and the people of Australia have had to respond to. And I think we have been well supported by all the officials who support government. And I could say a lot more, but I'd rather take your questions.
Thanks, Minister. And again, thanks to Ms. Wilkie and Mr. Gardner for appearing. I will hand it over to the opposition. I think it is either Mr. Secord or...
It's me, Mr. Shoebridge.
Mr. Wilkie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And hello, Minister, and thank you and to your officials for taking the time to join us this afternoon. We are picking up from some of the questions we were asking Treasury on Friday. And again, we appreciate the acknowledgement from the government about the bipartisan nature in which we've been operating as we all help to get small businesses through this crisis. I want to start with one of the initiatives which we called for, which you did implement, which was the $10,000 small business grants. This was meant to cover the $690,000 odd small businesses who don't pay payroll tax, who were left out of the first stimulus package. Minister, at the time that this was announced, it was meant to help 75,000 businesses with $10,000 grants. I just want to ask, how many small businesses have received the grants to date? How many have had their applications rejected? How many applications have been received? And what is the value of the monies that have been distributed?
Good, nice broad-ranging questions to start with. It's fantastic. I know there's been more than 25,000 applications, but perhaps Ms. Wilkie would have the actual details in relation to that. And I acknowledge your contribution, Ms. Wilkie, to that suggestion of the $10,000 grant.
Right, so as of the 19th of May, so Tuesday, there were over 34,000 total applications with a total requested value of 330 odd million. 25,237 applications have had a payment initiated.
Sorry, can you repeat that, Ms. Wilkie?
25,237 have had payments initiated, so approved, and the payment has been processed, with a total value of 249.41 million paid out. There are still 5,395 applications in progress, valuing around $50 million, and then just over 500 applications have not been approved.
How many have not been approved, Ms. Wilkie?
537.
And what were the main reasons for their non-approval?
I would have to take that on notice. Usually,
sure.
And it's usually eligibility issues.
Well, that's actually my next question, Minister. I've certainly been overwhelmed with feedback from small businesses and small business groups about the eligibility requirements, particularly the requirement, the $75,000 threshold requirement, as well as the 75% downturn requirement as well. Many people have said that to me that the 75% requirement for a downturn is too high, especially as JobKeeper is based on a 30% downturn, and the Victorian government, for its equivalent scheme, uses the JobKeeper 30% requirement. So can I ask, Minister, why was the 75% chosen? Why is it necessary? And is its purpose to rationalise access to the scheme?
Well, that's a fair call, I must say. That the government chooses an initial starting point in relation to it doesn't mean that it is necessarily set in concrete. And if in fact there is a case made for the extension or the lowering of the eligibility criteria in relation to either the $75,000 or the 75%, then I think that's something going forward we will consider. I can't hear you.
Sorry, Minister, I hope you can hear me now. I will endeavour to make myself heard to you. Going off your figures, if we've only had effectively 249 million of a $750 million program, only $249 million has actually gone out the door. This program is due to close in 9 days. Are you considering extending it?
A fair point. If in fact there has been a significant failure to take up the loan, then the government is prepared to consider increasing the eligibility criteria, and if that involves extending the application date, it's worth considering. I can't hear you, Mr. Mookie.
Sorry, I keep getting muted. You mean
sorry,
not...
sorry, Minister and Mr. Mookie. The difficulty is, Mr. Mookie, Mr. Secord, that when you ask a question and then rifle through your papers, it tends to obliterate the answer being given by the minister. So it would be appreciated if you could self-mute, but if you're not self-muting, the Secretariat are trying to mute you and unmute you in time so we can hear the minister properly. So if you could self-mute and exercise that, that would be great.
Do what?
So it's only, Minister, just to be clear, it's in relation to the grant that I was talking about. But
yes, just thank you. That's clear.
Yeah, clear. I just want to just say this to you though. We are assessing, or this inquiry in relation to the government's response to COVID-19 is taking place in the middle of the pandemic. So an answer given today may well be a different answer in 6 months' time relating to how we're assessing our response to the pandemic.
Yeah, I hear you clearly.
And the question you are asking me really highlights that problem, is that because we're conducting an inquiry during the middle of the pandemic, the totality of the government's response may in fact change.
I understand.
Minister, thank you for your attendance today. Now, I want to take you to employment, particularly in rural and regional areas. Now, the most recent unemployment data shows that the official unemployment rate in New South Wales is 6%. Now, we're particularly concerned about employment in rural and regional areas, especially in government agencies, government departments, government instruments. And I take you to the Forestry Corporation. Now, Forestry Corporation is very important in jobs in rural and regional areas. Now, is it correct that you are one of 2 shareholding ministers for the Forestry Corporation?
Correct.
Correct. As a shareholding minister, what are your responsibilities involving Forestry Corporation?
Well, in respect of all state-owned corporations, where I'm a shareholder, or primarily there is a responsibility for the agency or the state-owned corporation to make reports to the shareholding ministers in relation to the performance of the organisation. And it is also incumbent.
Sorry, Minister, go ahead. Sorry.
It is also incumbent upon the shareholding ministers to approve appointments to the boards of those corporations.
Thank you. So you, as the shareholding minister, you are responsible for appointments. Now, I think, how long have you been shareholder minister for the Forestry Corporation?
Well, for 12 months.
12 months. 12 months. And I noticed that you've signed off on the most recent annual report for the Forestry Corporation, October 31st. Minister Dominic Perrottet, Treasurer, Minister for Finance, Damien Tudaho. So yes, so you're responsible for the activities and the board. Now, are you familiar, when was the last time you've actually met or engaged with the board?
All right, Chair, point of order.
Yeah, Ms. Ward.
There's been a number of questions. I'm waiting for them to hold any relevance to COVID-19 pandemic response by this government. This is not budget estimates. I ask that you draw the Honourable Walter Cord back to the terms of reference of this inquiry, which is the government's response to the COVID pandemic. If there's some long bow that can be drawn from this line of questioning,
I get the gist of your point of order, Ms. Ward. I think it's been, I think it's fairly made at this stage, but I will note that the minister has come here prepared to answer questions in relation to retail leases and in relation to his small business portfolio. And we are having an inquiry in relation to COVID-19 pandemic. So, Mr. Secord, if you are going to make it relevant to the terms of reference and what the minister's here, if you could do it promptly, that would be useful.
I hear your ruling, Mr. Shoebridge. So it actually relates to jobs, COVID, and Forestry Corporation in New South Wales, an important job aspect that it has. Now, as part of the operation of the board, so the question that I asked before Ms. Ward took the point of order was about the operation of the board. So when was the last time that you had discussions with the board?
Well, I've had certainly one meeting with the board. The best of my recollection, I get reports from them. But quite frankly, to expect me to come here and answer questions in relation to that today is, I'm happy to answer questions on small business, not about the performance of the state-owned corporation, quite frankly.
Okay.
Minister, sorry, Mr. Secord. Sorry, Mr. Secord. Sorry, Mr. Secord. I'll just interrupt. Minister, I know you've come here to answer questions in relation to retail tenancies and small business. If there are matters that are put to you outside of that scope, you're within your rights to take them on notice.
Thank you.
Minister, so I'll bring you to the COVID aspect of my questions involving the Forestry Corporation and the board. During the current crisis, has there been any changes to the structure of the board in relation during the COVID crisis?
Well, I'm going to take the point of order. Chair, just mentioning COVID in the question doesn't make it relevant to the terms of the inquiry. It plainly...
Well, yeah, no, I take your point of order. I take your point of order. I think it may relate more broadly to our very broad terms of reference, but I've indicated before that if the minister is asked questions outside of what he was put on notice that this session would deal with, which is small business and retail tenancies, that the minister is well within his rights to take the matter on notice. It's a question for how the opposition wants to direct its time in that regard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll get right to the nub of my query. It has been put to us by whistleblowers that the Deputy Premier during the COVID crisis asked for the removal of Wendy Machin from the board of the Forestry Corporation because her friend and colleague, Leslie Williams, criticized the Deputy Premier during the COVID crisis.
It is outrageous.
I'll take your point of order.
This is just appalling. It's an abuse of parliamentary privilege to be doing this now. It's an abuse of parliamentary privilege generally. It has nothing to do with the terms of this inquiry.
All right. Does anybody else want to?
It directly relates to this inquiry and the conduct of the Deputy Premier and his travelling.
Absolutely not.
It is directly
Patient
it
abuse.
directly relates.
Could we deal with it? Could we deal with it at one point of time? I'll go to Mr. Secord and I'll come to you, Ms. Ward.
Well,
Mr. Secord.
I'm mindful of time. Mr. Shoeridge, please make a ruling.
All right. Before I do, I'll give Ms. Ward the opportunity to speak briefly to it.
Thank you. I think taxpayers of New South Wales who are paying for this inquiry and all the costs it entails to indulge Mr. Secord, the Honourable Walt Secord. Can we please get to the terms of reference for this inquiry, which is the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic? Nothing to do with it.
Look, I've taken a very. Thank you, Ms. Ward. Thank you. I've got the gist. I've got the gist of the point of order taken. Look, I have taken a very lenient approach to the terms of reference of this inquiry. They're very, very broad, but I do think I accept at this stage, that this question does not relate to the terms of reference. And I'm sorry, Mr. Secord, I think it's out of order at this stage. If we could return to the questions in relation to what the minister's here for us to answer.
Minister, let's talk about the land tax waiver scheme. And this is in relation to both your responsibilities as Small Business Minister and I guess finance in terms of revenue. I'm referring to the $440 million that's split into two components. The $220 million for commercial tenants and the $220 million for residential tenants. Can I ask how many, this is a process which is administered through Service New South Wales, but I presume you get reports. How many people have applied for the $220 million waiver in commercial, covering how many leases and how much money of the 220 has been granted? And can I ask the same question for residential as well? How much of the $220 million has been given to landlords to pass on to residential tenants? And how many applications?
Mr. Mookie, I don't want to tell you how to ask questions, but it was a great deal of help here if you'd ask one question at a time rather than 10 questions at a time. But I will ask Ms. Wilkie to potentially give the level of detail that you can ask for in relation to.
So is this about
land tax
relief? Just find the numbers that I do have. You are correct. We get some numbers through from Service New South Wales, but I'm not sure I have detail of what we just asked.
Well, while Ms. Wilkie's finding those numbers, Minister, can I ask how are you monitoring?
I can tell you this. As at the 19th of May, there have been around 1,500 applications. This is in relation to land tax. About 1,500 applications with approximately $111 million being claimed. Of these applications, 66% related to commercial properties and 34% related to residential.
34% on residential. So what's the total budget that's available for waivers?
$440 million.
So, and this is the waiver program that is due to close at 30 June 2019. We have 25% that's gone out the door. Can I ask, of that 34% of residential, that means what? We've got 50, 30, 40 million of the 220 million has been spent?
Well, $111 million of the 440.
So, Minister, your government's policy is to split that $440 million into two buckets, one 220 for residential, one 220 for commercial. You've said that 34% of 111 has gone to residential. So therefore, what we're looking at $30 to $40 million of the available $220 million. Is that about right?
What do you do, the maths?
Basic. Well, no, Minister, see, it's your job to do the maths. That's why you get paid. And we know that you're well prepared for these hearings. So please just tell us how much of the $220 million that's available to residential tenants for land tax relief has been paid.
for residential tenants?
Yes. Of the 220 million,
34% of the $111 million spent has been spent on residential tenancies.
all right. Minister, how are you monitoring landlords to ensure that they are passing on the relief to tenants by way of rent reduction?
It's a fair call, but, and I take it principally the application for a rebate of land tax involves a declaration about their obligation to pass that on to their tenant. Whether it is a rebate or land tax already paid, or alternatively an application for a deferral. Sorry, do you want to ask a question, Mr. Seekers?
No, we'd like to hear an answer. And from what we can tell,
Well, sorry, Mr. Tudor, Minister and Mr. Mookie. It works best if we just have questions and answers neatly given and not interrupt each other. And Minister, inviting it's not helpful either. So we might just go back to you to finish your answer.
Yeah, the chief process in terms of the monitoring of those applications is by way of the application process. The second component, of course, is involved in circumstances where tenants seek a mediation in relation to their responsibility to pay rent under their existing lease, and that mediation process gives rise to questions around the passing on of land tax obligations.
Does Ms Wilkie have those numbers?
No, I don't have those numbers with me. I'd have to take.
So we don't know how many okay. Minister, so other than a declaration,
it is incredibly difficult to distinguish between residential and commercial land tax. In any case, that's something that we would need to approach the Revenue New South Wales for.
Well, Ms Wilkie, I appreciate your point there, but the government's policy is to split the $440 million between the two. And if you're now saying that it's very hard to distinguish between it, how at all is it possible, therefore, to separate the buckets of money into two piles if you yourself don't know how to separate it?
So
that's for you, Minister.
Well, I'm not making any concession that we don't know how to separate, but it is a process that we would have to get revenue to do the analysis on. And I think they could do that analysis potentially, but it's not a figure which we have here today. But,
difficult, it's not impossible.
Difficult, but not correct.
Sorry, Mr. Mookie, that time has expired, and Ms. Wilkie and Minister, you've taken that on notice in terms of the figures to date. Is that right? Yeah, Ms. Boyd.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Minister.
Good afternoon, Ms. Boyd.
I wanted to start just by asking how, after the pandemic hit and it became clear that we were moving into a period of restrictions and an effective shutdown, how were the various packages for small business developed? What was the process?
Well, it's been a coordinated response, primarily led by the Commonwealth Government and the National Cabinet. So the response by the New South Wales Government generally has been to initiatives discussed and agreed at National Cabinet. And for the purposes of whether it's, there are some obviously early decisions which we were able to take in relation to payroll tax and the like, and there was an initial stimulus package by the state government in relation to making sure that we tried to help as many businesses as possible. But it's the point that I made earlier. We are still in the middle of this pandemic, and there's an ongoing process of decision making, and we had a stage one in relation to a stimulus package for the economy. There's a second stage where we offered additional support for by way of a stimulus package, and then clearly, then we've now moved to the retail commercial leases package. Now, no one is here today saying that that is the panacea for it all, and there will be decisions going forward which any government needs to continue to make sure that we try and get as many businesses through this process and get the economy returning to normal. Let me just make one point here, and it's a health-related issue. Anyone who suggests that the health issue is over is wrong. And one of the messages that needs to go to small business is that at the moment we are still dealing with a virus which is highly contagious, for which there is no cure, and that has the potential to kill people. That's the primary response of the government up to date, is to ensure that we developed policies and processes bearing that in mind. We are now going to a phase where we think that in many respects we have got the contagion rate down to a circumstance where the impact on businesses and the community generally is able to be managed. But it doesn't for one moment make the response go away, because we have still existent in the community a virus which is highly contagious and for which there is no cure. So that's why the response to the pandemic so far has been health related. Going forward, it is getting the economy to revive again, and whether it's tourism packages, whether it is reopening of businesses, whether it is a whole lot of workplace related issues in policy making. They're all those sort of things that we ought to be doing going forward to try and reopen the economy. And I'm sorry to have taken so long to answer that question. And I thank you for your patience.
No, and thank you for that description. That's very useful. It doesn't really answer the question, though. I'm not trying to trip you up. I'm just curious as to how you and the department officials worked out exactly what to release when those packages. Were you getting information in on which to base those decisions, or was there a bit of a we'll put this out and we'll see how effective it is? What was going on at that time?
Well, I'll ask Joanne to answer that, because she was intimately involved in the actual creation of those packages and the sort of the response that government was developing over a period of time. So
Ms. Boyd, there's basically the approach we took in providing advice to the government around this was first to look at what are the tools available to a state government in this sort of situation, understand the situation, and then look at where we were estimating the impact was going to hit. So in the early stages of the crisis, when the borders were closed, it was clear that international tourism, international students and education were going to be significantly hit. And that meant the education and tourist industries in New South Wales, which we have a significant reliance on in the economy, were going to be severely hit. So understanding that context and that where the impact was going to be hit was a key thing for where we would direct. And of course, small business is a very large set of businesses in the tourism sector in particular.
Could I ask you to narrow it down? Sorry, could I ask you to narrow your answer down to small business in particular, rather than the broader?
Yeah. So, yeah. Well, it's sort of a piece, I guess, in terms of the timing of the packages. That very much goes to in responding to this sort of economic crisis. The first and best tool from an economic perspective is monetary policy, which is the purview of the Reserve Bank. The Commonwealth Government has the biggest fiscal policy tools at its disposal, particularly through the automatic stabilisers of transfer payments and personal and tax. I know you wanted it to small business. I am getting to the point.
Okay.
The state government then does have discretionary fiscal policy at its disposal. And the best thing we can do is then complement what the Commonwealth Government does. So hence our packages. Sorry.
No, go on. I think I'm about to preempt what you were going to say, but I'll let you finish.
Yeah, so basically the packages that we put out, waited to see what the Commonwealth was going to do. So hence why our packages followed the Commonwealth Government packages by a few days. And we put our support complementing. So they, as we expected they would, went big on the transfers. So transfer issues, job seeker, job keeper. And we were able then to complement, particularly in the small business space, with things like the 10K grant program, because small businesses are particularly vulnerable in this sort of crisis, not just the ones that are closed down by restrictions, but also other businesses, because with less customers coming through the door, small businesses are always vulnerable to cash flow issues and that sort of thing. So hence the support around 10K grants, additional support through Business Connect, tax relief and licence fees, waivers and those sorts of issues. So it was knowing that small businesses' biggest issue is going to be cash flow, what could we do to support them on that front?
Okay, so coming up of that, what I'm understanding then is that there was a necessary delay between what the federal government was doing to then for you to identify the gaps, and then for the state government to attempt to fill those gaps. Two questions coming off of that. The first one is, I take it there was no contingency plan in place or pre-planning for any kind of a economic shock of this kind that would have provided a roadmap of the types of...
well, we haven't had a pandemic of this nature since the Spanish flu in 1918. So, but look, I mean, I was working in macro policy in the Commonwealth Treasury during the GFC. So to some extent, any economic crisis, there are certain, I guess, patterns of responses that you can use to adapt to any type of economic crisis. So
and that's the theory, but in terms of the actual plans of government, there's never been a particular plan that talks about economic shocks and what happens in economic shock, where the risks will be, what kind of support should be given during that time.
So again, the responses, so in looking at what has happened in previous shocks, economic shocks, you get an understanding. So we know that the impact on the labour market always lags what happens with economic
but that's not the same as a plan. So I'll ask the minister.
No, it's not, because every economic shock is different. So in the budget, in the half year or in budget last year and half yearly review, we did a scenario analysis around what would happen if China went into recession. So that has actually been quite helpful in terms of understanding this impact, because the impact hit China first and they had to shut down their economy as well. So that helped us understand, therefore, what was going to be the impact coming through into New South Wales.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on, because the second question coming out of that understanding of how these things are developed and rolled out is the obvious one, which is if JobKeeper and Job Seeker are going to end, presumably that is something that you can actually have a plan for, because it's reasonably likely to happen. Have you got in place plans for filling in the inevitable gaps that will follow when and if the Commonwealth Government pulls away that funding for small businesses? That's a question for you, Minister.
Well, the removal of JobKeeper and Job Seeker, of course, are Commonwealth decisions, but you're right, they will in fact be removed at some stage. The emphasis by the government at that stage has got to be a job creation policy position, where we are seeking to stimulate the economy by investment in infrastructure, where we have campaigns for regional tourism, bearing in mind that the impact on the tourism industry by the diminution of overseas tourism. But it'll be in circumstances where JobKeeper is removed, the immediate impact, or Job Seeker is reduced. The immediate impact of that is going to show up in people looking for jobs, and the emphasis of the government will be on those programs and those policies which are designed to create jobs.
There will be fewer jobs, presumably, if small businesses fail. So in terms of keeping those businesses afloat, is that not a priority of the government as well?
Well, the government isn't necessarily about making sure that every business succeeds. The priority of the government is to make sure that we create a set of circumstances where we give businesses the best opportunity of succeeding. Clearly, coming out of a crisis where customers are no longer walking into shops, tourists are no longer coming to the country, students have no longer enrolled in university. They are a whole set of circumstances whereby that has an impact on the business models of the organisations involved. Now, the policy of the government has got to be to adopt programs which try and revive the tourism industry, revive the university and education sector, and provide stimuluses to those small businesses either in retail, construction or the like, to be able to engage with the government or prosper in the community because of the existence of those programs. Now, if you're saying, should governments be supporting every small business when we have moved after JobKeeper, after JobSeeker? Potentially, there are some things we ought to be doing. Like I have to say that some of the principles relating to the national code in relation to retail and commercial leases. Maybe we've got to look at making sure that those negotiating opportunities are put in place so that rental obligations on some businesses continue for a period of time or the like.
Sure, but clearly there will be a lag, won't there, between when JobKeeper and JobSeeker fall away and when the economy is not going to just snap back to be what it was. It's going to take time to recover, and during that period, small businesses will be particularly vulnerable. It is not in the long-term interests of the economy for those small businesses to fail. So the question is, what will the New South Wales government be doing to ensure that they don't fail during that fragile period?
Well, and that's the problem of having this inquiry here, where you're asking us to be the prophets of what is going to occur in 6 months' time. There is no minister who will appear before you who will be able to give an accurate forecast about what the impact on the economy is going to be, and on specific retail industries or specific industries in 6 months' time. When JobKeeper finishes for some industries, a lot of people will return to work and their jobs will be revived. But there are people involved in the hospitality industry at the moment who are receiving a JobKeeper allowance, and there are no people staying, for example, in hotels or motels. Because of JobKeeper, they've been able to retain their jobs. What we are hoping, of course, is that when JobKeeper is reduced by or removed by the Commonwealth, most of those people hopefully will be in a position to return to work.
Have you identified the small business sectors that are particularly vulnerable as we head back into trying to rebuild the economy? For example, those that have a delayed impact from COVID.
Yeah, well certainly we are doing some work on that, and the Office of the Small Business Commissioner is in fact doing some survey work. Well, I'll ask Ms. Wilkie to sort of speak to some of the reaction of the small business community in relation to where they see the future. If you're asking us to sit here on the 19th of May 2020 and forecast what it's going to be like, all we can do is look at the forecasting of those small businesses. So
sorry, just in the interest of time, I would like to just ask you, Minister, I'm not asking you to be a fortune teller, to be able to look into the future and predict the economy. I think what the public are expecting from the New South Wales government is for them to be planning ahead and planning for the worst. So if there is to be a continued downturn, to know that the government is already identifying where the risks are and putting in place plans.
Well, then in that case, Ms. Boyd, I will be able to count on your support for a lot of the planning proposals which we have in place, which we want to fast track, to be able to make sure that we get a lot of the planning system, I suppose, freed up so that we can have a lot of projects and work opportunities.
How does that impact on small business?
Planning is an important component of a stimulated economy, because lots of projects which have been held up, whether it be in red tape, green tape, grey tape, yellow tape, brown tape, all those projects we need to be able to get out there and get moving on. And the Treasurer has been at great lengths to say but he wants those projects to be shovel ready and ready to go. And
Right. So
I'm
from a
glad to have your
small
support
business
this afternoon.
So from a small business perspective, not someone else's portfolio, are you saying that you are not actively identifying the risk areas and seeking to plan early for responses?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me give you an example. I was on a webinar last night and there was some really good input in relation to some small businesses who are saying to us, why aren't councils, for example, automatically approving outdoor dining facilities in circumstances where there is a DA in for the approval of a restaurant and the like? I don't know. The answer to that should be that there should be. And we ought to get rid of a lot of those red tape restrictions on small businesses so that we can give them the best opportunity of being more flexible. Some of the things we did have been doing during this crisis, for example, is we've allowed some restaurants to sell takeaway alcohol. Now that's the sort of thing that we ought to be looking at to pivot on, to say, well, maybe there are other ways that we can free up restrictions on some of those small businesses to expand their activity and have better opportunities to survive.
Are you planning on doing anything to support those small businesses in sectors that really rely on the casual workforce? So I'm thinking here of retail, food and beverage, even the arts sector, who aren't eligible for JobKeeper and have been doing it particularly tough, to help them to retain their staff? Well,
they're probably questions for other portfolios. If there is a specific small business, the hospitality sector being the local cafes and restaurants and those sort of organised. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
I've just spent some time. I've just spent some time talking to you about opportunities to reform our planning laws, potentially to reform our tax laws, potentially to
right. So no financial support to fill that gap.
You've been wanting me to say that, Ms. Boyd. Is there a financial package available? Is that what you want?
I'm asking you if there is a financial package coming to plug the hole that JobKeeper has caused, where casual workforce for small businesses are not receiving any kind of assistance. And so a lot of those people are having to be let go and those businesses are finding it hard to survive.
Well, I think
the answer is no.
The problem with that question is there is no yes and no answer. Every single business is an individual business with their own business model and their own opportunities for thriving as a business. I'm not going to sit here and say every business will survive this pandemic. No one's going to be here to say that. What we need to do is to put in place the best possible opportunities for those businesses to survive, and that may involve giving them an opportunity of expanding the way that they do business. But one of the really important things, I say this to you, is this. As every small business owner at the moment is faced with a myriad of opportunities to make applications for grants and the like. And the principal thing, one of the really important things that we've done, is increase the BizConnect program, where we have made business advisors available to business. We have made business advisors available to business to provide advice, A, about what is available to government, but B, also to provide advice about how to restructure their business, talk to their banks, talk to their suppliers and the like. It's not for the government to make the business successful. It's for the government to try and provide an environment about where they can be successful.
Oh, thanks, Minister. Thanks, Ms. Boyd. I'm sorry, this round has expired. We'll come back to you after 10 minutes with the opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Shoebridge. Minister, in your answer to Ms. Boyd, you referred to the job seeker, JobKeeper. With the unemployment rate at 6%, what has New South Wales Treasury or your department done any modelling on the removal of JobKeeper, job seeker on small business failure rates?
Not a better question for the Treasurer, quite frankly, Mr. Secretary.
Okay. Mr. Tudhope, I'm mindful of the earlier ruling. My question, if you can take this on notice, is very simple.
Sure.
Will there be any changes to the board of the Forestry Corporation involving the member Wendy Machin? Thank you.
Point of order, Chair. Point of order.
Yeah, look, I can predict your point of order, and I think I've already ruled on this question. That currently I was of the view that it was outside of the terms of reference and wasn't in order. So, Mr. Secord, we might just move on.
Minister, I want to turn now to the retail and commercial code and the regulation that you made to apply it in New South Wales. I've had a lot of feedback from a lot of small businesses about some confusions between the differences between the national code and the regulation that you proclaimed. Most has to do effectively with the definition of the pandemic period. I'm hoping you can clear that up for us. Can you explain what exactly is under the regulation the pandemic period in New South Wales?
Well, it's described, isn't it? It's defined.
No, it's not, Minister. It's not defined. This is the reason why there's confusion.
Let me just go to the actual prescribed period is defined.
So that code came in effect. That regulation was made.
Let's just be clear about this, Mr. Mookie. You've just asked me a question and you've said it's not defined, and it is defined.
No, but what's the date? What's the date?
It means the period ending at the end of the day, that is 6 months after the date on which this regulation commences.
So 24. Okay, so just slow down, Minister. Just slow down. It's okay. Just slow down. 24th of April. Is that what you're saying the date of the pandemic period is? Is that right?
No, I'm saying that's the prescribed period for the purpose of this regulation.
So it's a really straightforward question. In New South Wales, is the pandemic period from 24th onwards? Because we have a lot of landlords and tenants coming to us saying that who are having their requests for deferrals denied because it's been claimed that the pandemic period isn't clear. So it's a straightforward question, clear it up. Is it the 24th of April?
I hope you're giving them advice based on the definition, Mr. Mookie, because...
Can you just answer the question? Is it the 24th of April? Is that the definition of the pandemic period in New South Wales?
The definition period is defined in the regulation, and I agree with you that commenced on the 24th of April.
So then, Minister, why is it that on the Revenue New South Wales website that the application for land tax relief is set at the 3rd of April?
Well, why is that an issue?
Because
why can't land tax relief be granted?
Because there is at least 3 weeks of land tax reduction that people that landlords are entitled to, which doesn't mesh with the regulation, and this is what's creating the confusion. So I'm giving you the opportunity, quite generous of me, to just clear it up. Is that the pandemic period?
Well, quite frankly, I am astonished that you don't get the difference. That the decision in relation to land tax is completely different from the regulations which exist in relation to the obligation of landlords and tenants to negotiate their positions pursuant to the national code.
Minister, in New South Wales, what is the definition of the recovery period?
It's defined in the regulation.
Where? What is it?
It's defined in the regulation.
It's your regulation, Minister. It's not that hard a question. What is the recovery period?
It's not a hard question to read the regulation, Mr. Book. It says this. I'll read it again to you. So that you've got it clear.
The recovery
period. The prescribed period. The recovery period is not defined.
Yes, that's my point. Why is it not defined when the National Code says that these protections are available for the period of a recovery period? In New South Wales, there is no definition of a recovery period.
We've got a prescribed period instead.
Right. And so the prescribed period, is it 24 months? Or is it a JobKeeper requirement?
If you read the definitions.
So, Minister, in respect to the requests for mediations that have gone to the Office of Small Business, how many requests for mediations have been received by the Office of Small Business?
Again, the question is a confused one.
No, it's not. It's quite simple, Minister. How many parties?
Sorry, could I invite Mr. Mookie and the Minister. Minister, if you don't take issue with the question, but rather just try and answer it, we're less likely to have Mr. Mookie interjecting on top of you, because neither of those practices are helpful.
I know he's a great combatant. It's all good. I just put this to you, is that the process of mediation can actually be in many stages. What the process involves is, and someone may ring the Office of Small Business in relation to a leasing matter or potential mediation and be triaged in relation to some issue. I think that process can either now can primarily take place through Service New South Wales. So,
however you wish to describe it, Minister, just how many requests for assistance have you received from the Office of Small Business? That's it.
Point of order.
No, that wasn't the question you asked me.
Well, can you perhaps answer that question?
Sorry, Minister and Mr. Mookie, we have a point of order from Ms. Ward.
Thank you. It just would be helpful if the Minister could be allowed to complete his answer before Mr. Mookie comes in.
All right.
Top of a few months.
Yeah, I accept that. Look, we only have a limit. I accept the point of order. Yep, I think the point of order is well made, but Minister, we only do have a very short amount of time, and I think Mr. Mookie is expressing some frustration about the time it's taking to directly respond to the question. So could I ask you to try and be as directly relevant as possible?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. But I have to say that the question is multifaceted, because it depends upon what you call a request for mediation. A request for mediation might be a phone call to the Office of Small Business to be able to say, my landlord is telling me this, I'm saying this, can you help me? Then there is the actual formal application for mediation. Now, we've had 6,000 to the best of my knowledge, phone calls, requests for assistance to the Office of Small Business in relation to the opportunities to mediate. There have been 306, I'm told, actual mediation
Thank you, Minister.
applications.
Minister, the new Commissioner for Small Business isn't due to start work until June 15. Mr. Brady, who was the acting Commissioner, left to become the Chief Operating Officer of the Department of Customer Service just after our last round of budget estimates in February. From March to June onwards, who has been in charge of the Office of Small Business?
Well, Stephen Brady has been the acting Small Business Commissioner. We have seconded, I think, Sue Woodall from Procurement New South Wales, who has also assisted in relation to the day-to-day management of the Office of Small Business.
So when was Ms Woodall seconded?
Phil Gardner might be able to answer this. She's been there for some time now.
It was probably the middle to late March. So Mr. Brady has continued even now as the Small Business Commissioner. So there has been no gap when we have not had a commissioner or an acting commissioner. And he will continue as acting commissioner right up until the time that Chris Lamont starts on the 15th of June.
36.
How many additional staff have been provided to the Office of Small Business to assist with 6,000 requests and the 300 additional mediations?
I think I have some of the detail here in terms of the additional staff for mediation. To deal with the additional call volume, we have actually been working with Service New South Wales, and Service New South Wales are now the front door for all calls associated with small business. And where appropriate, those calls. So, for example, if an application for mediation is made, then that person is handed over then in a warm handover to the Small Business Commission to case manage that mediation. So.
All right.
Additional staff? Additional staff?
I may need to take it on notice.
And do you have an average time taken to complete mediation?
Sorry, Mr. Mookie, the time, this period of questioning, the time has expired. Minister, you will recall fairly recently the Parliament passed legislation which put in place a potential arrangement for fines to be reduced by 50% at the discretion of the Commissioner in the event somebody had difficulty paying for it and they were on a defined benefit. Do you recall that legislation?
I recall it intimately, Mr. Stewbridge, and I'm grateful to you for the new guidelines which now exist in relation to reductions in fines.
Yeah, so I wanted to check, what is the intention of the government to promote those guidelines and to promote the opportunity for people who are in receipt of those defined income support benefits to access the 50% reduction in their fines?
If you're asking me about whether have we actually been on an advertising program, the answer is no. However, all staff now who work in fines collection for Revenue New South Wales have been made aware of the opportunity of providing reductions in fine for those people who are impacted. And there is a specific direction in relation to seeking to, certainly during COVID, to manage fines and manage fine collection in circumstances where we are much more cognizant of people's circumstances. And there have been some tragic circumstances where that some of our staff have had to deal with, including one member of staff who had to make a call to a lady whose husband had recently passed away as a result of COVID. So I have the utmost admiration for the staff at Revenue New South Wales. There is a systematic approach to being much more considerate about people's circumstances, and certainly in relation to applying those guidelines.
Right. Could you provide on notice, if you've got them now, by all means, but how many reductions have been granted?
No.
How many have been refused, and whether or not the ability to make such application is communicated each time a fine is issued?
That's a fair call, probably not related to COVID, but it's a fair call. I think the actual guidelines only come into effect on the 4th of July, I think it is, that the actual obligation to administer the guidelines.
Well,
anyway,
could I ask you to use your best endeavours to bring them in earlier than that, because they'll clearly be needed in the context of COVID-19, which is what I'm putting to you, Minister.
Yeah, no, I understand.
All right. Sorry, Ms. Boyd.
Thank you. Minister, in the last round of questions, you mentioned how it is difficult in the middle of this pandemic to be commenting. I don't want to put words into your mouth, but basically the idea that it might be easier in a few months when we can look back at the totality of the response rather than it being in the middle of it, which I understand. If we were a few months in the future looking back, how would you measure the success of the responses that you have put in place so far for small business?
Well, it's the same question asked in a different way, isn't it? Government and generally ministers should gauge success by, I suppose, the manner in which the community reacts to the programs that they've put in place. And going forward, we will administer policies and we will be judged on those policies by the electorate going forward.
So it's not.
There's some things that we can do to try and educate ourselves about what the policy should be, what the the way that the community is thinking, or the way the constituency is thinking, by the way small business is thinking about things which we potentially could do, you know, and that's the purpose of always continually doing survey work of the small business community or the like, to make sure that hopefully we are in sync with the sort of things that they're wanting us to do to try and make doing business easier. But to sort of say, well, I want you to set out the parameters now where we can come back and judge whether you have been successful in managing the small business component of the pandemic. I just think that's an impossible question.
Sure, maybe I'm tipping you to what my questions will be in the future, but I would expect I would expect you to be able to tell us how effective the measures you've put in place were, what impact they had compared to what they might have had if you hadn't put them in, and to look, for example, at how many businesses have failed. So you said. Sorry.
But I can tell you this. So in other words, one of the things we're noticing is that during the period of the pandemic, we do measure the extent to which business confidence is moving. Now, that's one way that we would look to see whether the policies are working. And we've now conducted the Office of Small Business has conducted surveys about business confidence during that period. Now, that's sometimes a reflection of whether we're getting the policies right.
Mm-hmm.
At the beginning of the pandemic, when businesses were shut, when health orders were in place, the community was in hibernation, business confidence was very low. It was about 17%. As we have started to get the pandemic under some sort of control, it's increased, and I think it was 32% at the next time that they did the survey in terms of business confidence. And the last one we did was increased, and I don't have that figure immediately available, but it was increased again. So people are starting to say that the conditions for our business surviving are improving. Now, they're the parameters we look at for the purposes of seeing how policy positions are going.
That is an indicator. It's not necessarily an indicator of success of your particular responses, but it certainly could be, and I accept that. You said before that it's not your job to stop every business failing, and clearly that is correct. But at what number of small businesses failing do you look back and say, actually, we could have done more?
Oh, well, that's an impossible question to ask, because it may well have nothing to do with the policies of the state government. There might be a stock market crash tomorrow. Now, the state government could never have in place a policy which will prevent a stock market crash. They're sorts of things that we will only know in the future about how the economy is evolving. What steps is the Commonwealth Government taking in relation to stimulus packages? So the combination of all those facts and circumstances, which may exist in 6 months' time, will give us a better guide about how the economy is going and how we are emerging from the health crisis which we face and may still exist.
So the Federal Treasury said today that they're expecting a U-shaped recovery rather than a V-shaped recovery. Is that your view as well?
Well, you had the New South Wales Chief Economist appear before you last week, and he said exactly the same thing to you.
That's right. So do you personally agree with that as well?
Well, I'm happy to agree with the advice of the New South Wales Chief Economist.
Okay. And final question from me. Do you have any figures as to how many failures of small businesses we've already seen? How many bankruptcies and insolvencies during the as a direct result of the pandemic?
I think it's too early to tell that figure, although it is one that I have asked the Treasury to collect, is the number of liquidations and insolvencies and we can measure that through whether it's federal court or Supreme Court proceedings for winding up and liquidations, or for that matter, appointments of administrators. Now, I just don't think those figures are meaningful yet. I think probably as JobKeeper and JobSeeker start to be removed and we are asking the economy to stand on its own feet again, then we will have a better picture about those businesses which have been able to pivot and restructure, reorganise. And one thing we ought never forget in this is that part of the response to the pandemic has been by banks who have in fact provided deferrals of loans for business for a six-month period. Now, the impact of a lot of the removal of those either benefits or alternatively the requirement to start paying back deferred obligations will have a significant impact, and it's probably, again, the point that I made is it's really difficult to tell as we sit here now how businesses are going to move through that period going forward.
All right. Our time for questioning has expired. Minister and the officials with you, thank you for your attendance today and addressing the questions from the committee. I think you're right. There are very troubling economic future ahead of us when a series of measures potentially unwind at the same time. It may well be that there'll be a requirement or a request for you to return again, and we can work out what the pathway forward is for New South Wales. But thank you to yourself and the staff today for your assistance to the committee.
And thank you to the committee.
That concludes this afternoon's live streamed